Okay, good morning everybody. Well, it's morning for me. I'm not sure what time of day it will be for you, but let's just push on. The purpose of this podcast is to take you through how to answer a Section A question for the Germany paper for Edexcel. We're going to use a worked example, which is a source from the year 1871 about the socialist reaction to the unification. There's the question. Study source A, and you can see that beneath the question, the first thing I have done, which would be hopefully the first thing you would do in the examination, you wouldn't need to write this bit down, but it is obviously crucial that you analyse the question. And notice that I've analysed that there are 5 elements to the question. There are 2 things that you need what we call lines of inquiry, okay, and so effectively 2 questions you need to answer within it. The first question is how far Germany was unified. Now, as soon as you see that word how far, the 2 words how far, it's saying that section of your answer needs to be balanced. It needs to look at evidence that it was a unified entity, and it needs to look at a counter-argument that there was division. So again, you should be analysing, I just put unity, D for division, something like that. Then you've got 3 skills you've got to demonstrate. You've got to demonstrate that you can make inferences, because it says explain your answer using the source. You've got to demonstrate that you can evaluate provenance, because it says using the information given about the source's origins, and you need to include precise additional own knowledge about the historical context. Now, the context, come on to that one in a second, is crucial. The context is understanding the immediate circumstances that the source was made in terms of time and place, etc. So it says that in the question, and your own knowledge about the historical context. I put at the bottom there, see the generic mark scheme on the last page. We won't go through it as part of the podcast, but there is a generic mark scheme, and you will notice those same 3 strands, the making an inference, using your own knowledge, and evaluating provenance, appear within each graded level for each strand. So you need to be demonstrating that at all levels to achieve any particular band. Okay, let's move on. Right, now we have the source itself. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take you through very quickly effectively what you should be aiming to do in the examination. I would say in the examination, I mean, you've got to allow time to read the source, and it is really important that while you're reading the source, you've got the question in your mind as of just taking a shoot through there, but also that you are underlining and annotating the source so that you can use the information to answer the question. Okay, so we'll do it in various ways. So the first thing is we're going to zoom in here. Remember, you've got to answer the question with regards to the provenance. The provenance is the bit at the top that tells you when the source was written and who by. Okay, so this is a key bit for about thinking about your own knowledge. First thing, always look at the date. The source was written, was a speech in November 1871. I would be straight away thinking, right, well, I know that in January 1871, Germany was unified, so 8 months since the unification, okay? 8 months since the unification. I see the word socialist, I think in context, okay, I know that in May 1871, in other words 6 months earlier, the socialists had seized control of the capital Paris, the French Commune, the Paris Commune, and that's important because that would have created shockwaves in Germany, and I know from my own knowledge that Bismarck, as a result of the events in France, felt that a similar thing could happen in Germany, and so in the second half of 1871 the German socialists were under attack from Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. That's useful context. Doesn't mention it in the textbook, that's not the point. This is A-level, you need to demonstrate precise own knowledge beyond just knowing and understanding the textbook. August Bebel, okay, so you'd be thinking, right, well, he is the leader of the Social Democratic German Workers' Party. So, you should be thinking, who is he? What is his purpose? We'll come on to that in a second. So the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany. Remember, it wasn't called the Social Democratic, the SDP, until later. Now, you're told that he's denouncing the lack of constitutional and political rights for the German federal states. You're given little clues. You're told about the fact that he's criticising the way Prussia dominated the system. Use that information, but don't go overboard about it. I mean, it's important to use it. Show the examiner you're aware of that in the answer. The weaker candidates will just simply keep repeating that point over and over again. Clearly, that is a prompt for you, but you've got to do much more than that. Okay, next thing that you're going to do is you're going to look through the source to find out what inferences you can make. So that's a question of relating key lines to those two different inquiries. Let's start off with inquiry 1. I'm just going to pull back a little bit so we've got a bit of space, okay? So we'll start off with inquiry 1. Now, inquiry 1 is how far was Germany unified? And remember, you've got to be thinking of evidence for unity, but a counter-argument that Germany was still divided, okay? So I will use one colour. This is a good technique to use in the exam. I would use one colour. I'm going to use blue for the first inquiry, how far Germany was united. So I'm immediately going to pick up on the fact about the Norddeutsche, about Bismarck's press organ. Notice how it says the Reich Chancellor, so I'd write Bismarck, that's important, show knowledge, okay, who the Reich Chancellor is. He's got a propaganda department, basically, a press organ. Use the word propaganda. That today's vote is yet more proof of the cooperation of the Centre Party and the Socialist Party. Right, I would say that is, I'll use E1, inquiry 1, okay? And that's, I'll put unity, inquiry 1, unity, okay? Because clearly he's saying that Bismarck was claiming that the Socialists and the Centre Party were working together, and everyone has a bit of a laugh about that, so there's obviously a lot of irony there. So the point is, you're trying to make is, Bismarck is claiming there is national unity, is the point you want to make there. He then goes on, if this motion were to pass, the jurisdiction of the Reichs authority would have to be extended. Well, that's obviously about the extent of German unity. So I'll just again annotate that inquiry 1, but I would actually call it D for division, because it's clearly saying that there is a need for the rights of authority to have to be extended. It suggests that there is more work to be done. Let's go down a little bit further. What else have we got? The Chancellor's remark here. Okay, so again, Bismarck has remarked that their liberalism still lagged far behind Prussia. So a similar sort of point. That's relevant for inquiry 1, which is about how far there was unity, and it is about division. Okay, so that's obviously relevant. I'm going to move down a little bit further. We've got a reference to the state of impotence down here, the state of impotence, putting an end to their independent activities. Again, I would say that's relevant to inquiry 1 because it is evidence of the centralising tendency of Prussia, that Prussia is putting an end to any independence, so that is imposing unity, so that would be relevant. Then you've got a line here, the persecution of our party, in other words, the persecution of the Socialist Party. You can use that either way, I suppose, but that again is inquiry 1 because it's evidence of socialist opposition to the attempt by Bismarck to impose unity on Germany, which, by the fact that they're doing that, implies that there is division. And then at the bottom you've got the loss of any liberal spirit that the small states once had. And again, that's inquiry 1. That you could say is evidence of unity because the southern states are losing their independence. So there's quite a lot you can use for the first inquiry. I'll then switch to a different colour. I'll use red, and we'll do exactly the same for the second inquiry. Now, the second inquiry is asking about the reaction to the unification. Obviously there's lots here about the socialist reaction. You've got in the middle there, God forbid gentlemen. So I'll just put a reference there. That's inquiry 2, because it's about socialist support for the unification. There's almost an irony there. If you read between the lines, he's saying we're being accused of supporting the existence of the small states, but possibly an ironic suggestion. And we do know from our own knowledge that the socialists were not anti-unification, they were more anti-Prussian dominance of Germany. But okay, so you could develop that point with your own knowledge. And he talks about Prussia's absolutist military appetite there. Linked to that, constitutional life in the small states was more rounded. So again, that will be inquiry 2. Clearly there's opposition to further expansion of Prussian power coming through in all of those statements. So moving on, other references. Yes, there's that nice line towards a little bit lower down about playing policy bailiff. Where we are, policy bailiff for Prussia. That the smaller states are just functionaries of Prussia, and that they have lost their independence and they're just simply doing the bidding of Berlin. Okay, so we'll pull back. You shouldn't really in the exam spend more than about 5 or 6 minutes doing what I've just done there, which is probably about the amount of time I've just spent doing that. But you're, I think, pretty ready now to sort of like launch into answering your question. You've got annotations, you've got plenty of material highlighted to start answering your question. Okay, so on your handout, I'm not going to take you through blow by blow every single point. You can read these yourself. I think I've listed 18 points in general feedback about techniques you should be using for answering your question. I'll just go through these very quickly and then we'll just get straight into the actual plan itself. Obviously that first point about making sure your topic sentences are strong, sort of zooming in there. So I've given examples of topic sentences. Be quite explicit that you are answering the question. So paragraph 1, firstly it is important to evaluate the provenance of the source in order to evaluate its strengths and limitations, something like that. Paragraph 2, having considered the provenance, there's your link. It is now important to assess the content of the source with regards to the first inquiry, which is asking how far Germany was unified. Okay, again, strong topic sentence. Paragraph 3, the source also gives valuable information, that word also is a link, about reactions to the unification, especially the socialist response. And then paragraph 4, it's also important to consider the breadth of material covered by Babel, which is clearly a weakness of the source for historians. So that's clearly introducing what you're going to do in that fourth paragraph, which is evaluate the breadth and the comprehensiveness of the source. Okay, so very, very, very strong topic sentences that show that you're answering the question. Okay, I'm going to jump to point 4 here, just moving down a bit. this is where you really show it's about your introduction. Now, the introduction is a key point, one of the key elements of the answer, where you demonstrate that precise own additional knowledge. Remember, it says in the question about place the source into context. So let's have a look at what I've done. I've pretty much given an example. In this instance, you could show knowledge of who Bebel was. He was a radical socialist leader, along with Wilhelm Liebknecht of the Social Democratic German Workers' Party. He was an Eisenacher, which was a radical. He was not a Lassallean. So you can make a reference to the Eisenach conference where the party split. And there's the 8 months after the unification, 6 months after the Paris Commune, in which revolutionary socialists seized control of the French capital. Those events had alarmed Bismarck, who as a result intensified his attacks on German socialists. And here's, I think, very relevant point. He is addressing Bebel. He doesn't say it, but he's obviously addressing the Reichstag. He's addressing the members of the Reichstag. Well, you should know, and it doesn't. This is where you've got to demonstrate knowledge, that this small party, the Social Democrats, only got 3% of the seats. They haven't got that many seats. You could mention the other parties. I think the Centre Party had, 19% of the seats. The National Liberals had 30% of the seats. Show your knowledge. William Carr, page 132 to 3, is very strong on that. Also in the introduction, give a taster of what your conclusion is likely to say. I need to know your line of argument. Look at the modelled examples in the textbook, but there are quite a few in the Edexcel revision guide. Read those introductions, get a sense, start learning how to write introductions. There are others there. Avoid making assertions. There's a bit of guidance about the final building block about comprehensiveness. And a whole list of points on the next slide. Pause this podcast, read those through yourself, those points. All of them are useful, but I don't need to read to you. I want to get straight into the actual plan itself in this next part of the podcast. Okay, so the detailed plan. So I've already given you a detailed lesson about a recommended approach for writing essays for Section A. And I basically said sort of 6 main building blocks. The building block 1 is your introduction, building block 6 is your conclusion, which means there are 4 main building blocks in the main part of the answer. Okay, and I think it's important with the first building block that you really get into just focusing on the provenance of the source. Showing awareness of, and I always have those 2 words in my head. You've got to show awareness of the purpose of the author, okay, who's he speaking to and why, what does he hope to achieve, and you've also got to ask questions about the authority of the source. In other words, is the author in a position to know what he or she is speaking about or writing about? And you've got to make it balanced. You've got to evaluate, which means you've got to consider both the strengths and the weaknesses with regards to purpose and authority. Okay, so again, what I would do is I just pause this podcast and read what you got in front of you, and then I'll just give a quick comment. Okay, so obviously a key strength is that Bebel is the leader of the socialists, okay, or joint leader of the socialists, which means his experience is influential, he's well positioned, that's authority, isn't it, okay, to know how the political left would react to the unification. He is speaking with authority, okay, he's not a sort of like low-ranking member of the socialists. If he says this is what the socialists feel, then a lot of people are going to be influenced by him. Okay, all the socialist members of the party would be influenced, or many of them, although you could pick up on the fact there is division within the party, and some of them are Lassalleans and wanted to be more cooperative with the political centre and right. Clearly, though, there are many weaknesses. Okay, the speech is made in November 1871. The source is only a snapshot of one moment in time. It was made prior to many of the things that we know eventually happened. So we know that Bismarck worked with the National Liberals to strengthen unification. So we know that that's an opportunity to make reference to things that happened later. Okay, a nice word is that we as historians have the advantage of hindsight. It's both an advantage and a disadvantage. But one of the weaknesses is that it's only a snapshot at that moment in time. It is a speech. Presumably he is addressing members of the Socialist Party. We know he's playing to the audience. It keeps making references to laughter. He's probably addressing that part of the chamber. He's probably in the Reichstag chamber addressing the 3% of his own members. We're not told, but if you're not told who the audience is, hypothesise. You make an educated guess. He claims that Bismarck will produce a biased press release the next day, although that hasn't happened yet. He asserts that the southern states are impotent, whereas in reality they actually did retain some powers. That is a good example of bias, isn't it? Okay, don't just assume because it's a source it's going to tell the truth. If you do identify bias, either because he tells a deliberate lie or because he twists the truth to suit his purpose, then it's really important you go for that and fill in the gap. That's obviously an example to say, well, look, no, the southern states were not impotent. They had representation in the Bundesrat. There was, through their membership, the power of veto, although it was never actually used. We do know that the southern states are allowed to retain their own army. Babel doesn't mention any of that because it doesn't suit his purpose. Okay, so that makes it a weakness. So the historian has got to use it carefully. Don't just assume everything that he says. Okay, so that's building block 1. Moving on. Building blocks 2 and 3. Here's building block 2, are very much the inferences. I won't read through them line by line. We picked up on those in the when we're annotating the actual source. So this is where you really go into the source. So remember how on the source I annotated the building block 2, the first inquiry, how far Germany was unified. I underlined all of those in blue. Okay, so you're picking up those blue underlinings, and you'll see that I've listed them there. Okay, as evidence. And from those blue underlinings, you're making inferences. Okay. Now, the first thing, remember how I said that it is how far Germany was unified. Every time you see the word how far, you've got to think I've got to present both sides of the argument. So here is the argument for unity, and here is the argument for division. So I would have actually split that into 2 paragraphs. So making inferences from the source, there are some inferences I can make that say that Germany was unified, and there are some that I could make that say that Germany was actually divided. And it's the classic sort of approach from GCSE. An inference is a combination of 2 things. Okay, state the inference and use the word it suggests or it infers. So take one here. Inference. It suggests that the government created a perception of national unity, that Bismarck was trying to create a perception that it was a united country. How do we know that? The public claim, that's where Bismarck is claiming that the blacks and the reds are cooperating. Another one you could mention was the use of the press organ. The second inference, it suggests that the creation of the North German Confederation has been a move towards the creation of a more centralised authoritarian Germany with power centred on Berlin. And there is the supporting evidence. Lots of just short little quotes. State of impotence, independent activities have been put to an end. They now do little more than play policy for bailiffs for Prussia. The 3 states have lost their liberal spirit. So pepper your answer with short little quotes, but make sure those short quotes sit behind the inference. Okay, so you can see that in the second half of that argument, evidence for division. Make your inference. It suggests that Prussia's power is not yet complete, and then include some short quotes. Make an inference. It suggests that unification was justified by Bismarck as necessary because of the political backness of the small states, and support it with the short quotes, and so on. Once you've done that, move on, because you're working to a time limit, and the next building block is inferences for the second inquiry. Now the second inquiry is reactions to the unification. I'm going to switch my pen here, because remember when we actually planned it, we underlined this in red. Now obviously you're writing your answer in one pen, but for the planning stage, and just for me to demonstrate, I'm just going to move back to the red colour. Okay, so it's exactly the same. Notice how, again, more than one inference, and they're different inferences. That's really important. You saw that with the previous paragraphs. The weaker candidates would tend to make one inference and then just repeat it over and over again. Be punchy, move on, look for different inferences. So I've got 3 inferences. Okay, it suggests that the socialists support the notion of unification, at least in principle. There's a line about, God forbid, gentlemen, the irony that we should be disagreeing. He is saying we're not against unification, we're against Prussian dominance. It suggests that the socialists are against Berlin extending its power further. So again, you've got reference to Prussia's absolutist military might. Bebel is campaigning against a motion which, if passed, will strengthen Berlin's powers even more. So again, notice short little quotes. The key thing is put things into your own word. You must demonstrate understanding. Make your inferences to the third one. It suggests that the socialists oppose further unification because it will suppress liberalism in the smaller states. And again, lots of short examples. If you're writing about under pressure of time, don't feel you've got to put all those little examples in. It depends on how fast you write, but you've got to be punchy. So that's effectively one paragraph there. Make reactions, the reactions to the unification, 3 inferences, bang, 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 knock them home and support each with a precise piece of information. On the top of the page there's actually a 4th one there, an inference. It suggests that the socialists believe the smaller states have now been reduced to the status of functionaries of Prussian power. Again, a good example, when you're making an inference, always put things in your own words. He says policy bailiff for Prussia, but you've got to demonstrate that you understand what the phrase policy bailiff means. Okay, so you've written 3 main paragraphs so far. You've done provenance, you've done a building block about the first inquiry, which you probably split into 2, because it's saying how far, evidence for unity, evidence for division, and then you've done a building block about the second inquiry, which is about the reaction to the unification. At that point, many candidates just think, I've ticked all the boxes, and I can move on to my conclusion. I think it's really important that you address one more part of the inquiry, which is about the historical context again, to evaluate comprehensiveness and depth. What we're basically saying here is you're being asked 2 lines of inquiry. Okay, how far was Germany unified, and what was the reaction to the unification? And you're told to use your own knowledge about the historical context. And I think if you suddenly stop the essay at this point, you've actually missed out some significant points, because part of it is actually saying, what does Bebel not talk about? Okay, now this kind of rounds it back, because this kind of like returns to the issue of provenance. In your first paragraph, you will have pointed out that he is looking at it from the socialist perspective. He is talking about the reaction to the unification and how far Germany was unified as a socialist would see it. But there is a lot of things that are relevant to those 2 lines of inquiry that he does not mention, and so you need to be sort of picking those up. And that's a great opportunity to sort of like really plug in the gaps. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and there's a few big gaps there, and fill those gaps with your own knowledge and bring that in. And you can relate back to the issue of provenance, which kind of rounds it off. It's part of that creating a line of argument that goes through your answer. So what are the key things the key points I would actually make here? I would just zoom in a little bit, okay? So I would actually make the point that Bebel's speech only focused on one aspect of disunity, the political divide. okay, because he talks a lot about Prussian authoritarianism against liberalism. Okay, showing your vocabulary there, but he doesn't talk about other divisions. Okay, no reference to religious divisions. So you could briefly mention Catholic versus Protestant. No reference to ethnic divisions. So you could mention about the Poles, the French, the Danes. They were divisions that were relevant as well. Secondly, Babel's speech is clearly addressing the party faithful. He's getting a lot of laughter, presenting a negative reaction to the unification. So he inevitably is not going to say that there was a great deal of support, but you know that. There was a lot of support for the unification, and in particular the support came from the middle classes, the businessmen, the professionals, and that was reflected in the National Liberals. We've already said the National Liberals had 10 times as many seats in that first Reichstag. The Socialists only had 3%, the National Liberals had 30%. And Bismarck wasn't daft. He formed an alliance with the National Liberals because they were in support of the unification. So clearly there's a lot that Babel isn't talking about. Okay, many Germans did support the unification. Thirdly, Babel exaggerates the case for disunity. And by exaggerating, and also about Prussian oppression, and as a result he neglects to present evidence that in fact the Reich was much more liberal than he states. So he does overstate that. We gave that example earlier. There were 4 separate armies, of which the Prussian army was just one. The powers of the Reichstag, the Reichstag, it was Germany had introduced a system in which all men over 25 and over had a vote. Well, that was the most democratic system in Europe in terms of one man, one vote. Yes, we do know that there were separate state parliaments, and in particular the Prussian Landtag had a very, very weighted vote that weighted more for the upper classes, but for the imperial vote, the vote for the empire, it was a much more liberal system. So Babel neglects to include that in his picture. So therefore fill in the gap. We do know that the smaller states were represented in the Bundesrat. There were 58 seats. We know that Bavaria had 6 seats. Okay, yes, Prussia has 17, but nevertheless there was representation in the Bundesrat. Babel ignores that, so you fill in those gaps. The source also implies unity within the Socialist Party. He's getting lots of laughter, etc. Well, you know that there were divisions. You know that actually Babel was an Eisenacher and there were Lassallians. Again, go to Carr, William Carr, page 132 to 3, if you want more knowledge on that. But this is A-level. You've got to be demonstrating more than just the textbook. And finally, candidates could use their own knowledge to develop and expand on Babel's arguments. So other things, you could have mentioned, for example, the anniversary. Socialist politicians rejected the anniversary of the Battle of the Sedan as a national holiday because they saw it as a celebration of the right-wing militarism, and so on. We've already mentioned the Eisenach programme. I think the key point I'm making here is, remember, it does say in the question that you must use your own knowledge about context, and there are some obvious places to do that in your introduction, in the paragraph about provenance, and in this paragraph about comprehensiveness and breadth, but also pepper it throughout the answer, every opportunity. So the source refers to the Reich Chancellor. You know that's Bismarck. Make sure you say it's about Bismarck. Don't miss any opportunities to bring your own knowledge in. Okay, hopefully that was useful to you. I'll upload this to YouTube, and you've got the advantage, just save the link and you can play it over and over again, and use this information, use the advice in this to help you write your next answer to your next Section A question. Thank you very much.